Hello and welcome back. This week we're going to talk about how to lay out your design in Photoshop in a way that's going to follow the principles of design and in the end result in your project looking as appealing as possible. Some of the things that we're going to cover this week include making your resolutions correct and your sizes correct for both print and the web. We'll talk about the four major principles of design: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And we'll go over some tips for layout and creating alignment and creating margins and those sorts of important things. Now let's go and open up Photoshop and talk about some of these resolutions and these different sizes. Now, when you go to File, New, we're all pretty familiar with the new project window by now. Let's take a look at some of the types of documents that are available in the preset. Now, particularly take a look at some of the web sizes. We have some different resolutions here for desktop backgrounds, for backgrounds that you might use for the web, for a website, for instance. And when we click on one of these sizes, we'll see that the resolution is 72. That's because 72 resolution is what you will use whenever you're making something for the screen, whether it is a banner for a advertisement that's going to go on the web, or something that you're going to put up on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. You will use a 72 resolution. Now let's look at a project that you might use for print, such as a photo, for instance. And you'll notice here that the resolution is 300. So 300 is the standard resolution that you would use for making a project for print, such as a poster or a flyer or a magazine advertisement, anything that's going to be printed out. And 72 resolution is what you're going to use for the web. Now, in the color modes, RGB is the standard color mode for when you're making something for the screen. And CMYK is the standard color mode if you're making something for print. The thing is, though, RGB is going to give you access to more adjustment layers, more blending modes, more filter options than CMYK is going to give you. So if you're going to be making something that is intended both for the web and for print, what you might want to do is start with RGB color mode, and then when you save your JPEG that's going to go on the web, save it in RGB mode, and then when you're ready to save that file that's going to go to print, go up to, after you've made your document, go up to image at the top of the screen, and you'll see mode up here. And this is where you can then change your resolution or your color mode to CMYK. Okay, let's make let's make a poster that's going to be intended for print, right? Use a poster size. Remember, we're working in inches, not pixels, because if you were to make something that's 11 pixels by 17 pixels, it would be very, very small. Next, we'll change the resolution to 300, and I'll leave it at RGB color mode, and I'll then change it when I'm ready to save that design for print. Now, let's talk about some handy ways to lay out our design in a way that's going to be appealing. And we have some tools in Photoshop that's going to help us with our alignment, with our margins, and with organizing our document. And this is the guides and the grids. You'll look up here at the top of your workspace, and at the side you see a ruler. And if you don't see that ruler, hit Command or Control R on your keyboard. And that is the shortcut key to make your ruler go away, and Command and Control R to make your ruler come back. Now, this ruler is really handy because it's going to allow you to pull out your guides. Let's see how we do that. So if you click on your ruler, just click on a blank empty space on your ruler, click with your trackpad and drag down. You'll see, ta-da, you can make a handy little guide there. Now if I go over to my ruler on this side, I can pull out a guide here. And what I'm doing here is I'm making just like a 1/4 inch margin. And a 1/4 inch margin is good because you never know, if your edge of your document is going to get cut off by the printer. So it's a good idea to kind of make a 1/4 inch margin around the edge of your document so that any important text or images is inside that area, so it doesn't accidentally get cut off by the printer. Now, as I was dragging it, it kind of snapped back to the edge of the document, so I will want to move this guide again. So I'm going to get out my Move tool, and then I'm going to drag my line until it lines up right there on the 1/4 inch mark. Now I want to make a line down here and a line over here. All I have to do is go up to the top of the document, click on the ruler, and then drag down. And same on this side. Click on the ruler and drag down. And here are some handy guides. And again, it kind of snapped to the edge of the document. So I'm just going to move it back into place there. Now you might be noticing that my guides are kind of this greenish yellow color. That's because I've manipulated the settings a little bit. If you go up to Photoshop and then you go to Preferences and then you go to Guides, Grid, and Slices, this is where you can change your settings. So right now my grid lines, which we haven't brought up yet, are a green color. So when we do bring them up, you'll see the green. And my guides, which are what I just drew, are this yellowish green color. So to simply change them, I can just click on this color. I can choose any other color I want. And as you can see, my guides change. This is helpful. For instance, let's say I were to have a yellowish green background on my document. If I had my guides as yellowish green, then I wouldn't really be able to see them on my document. So by changing the color, I'm able to see my guides a little bit better. You also have some options for different styles of your guidelines. So you can choose between dashed lines like that, which look like little dashes, or straight lines. Next, let's get to the grid. And I think by default, when you guys see your grid for the first time, it's going to be in inches, and I think it might be in a gray color. So I'll try and mimic the way your grid is going to look. And let's bring it up. So the way we bring up our grid is with shortcut keys. Command apostrophe. Command apostrophe brings up your grid. And if you forget the shortcut keys to bring up the grid or to bring up the guides, you can go up to View up at the top of the screen in Photoshop, and then go to Show, and then click on either Guides or Grid. And you'll also see that the guides are, the shortcut key to bring up the guides and make them go away is Command semicolon. So let's do that. Command semicolon to make the guides go away, Command semicolon to make the guides come back, and Command apostrophe to make the grid go away, Command apostrophe to make the grid come back. Now, right now it's set up to have a grid line at every 1 inch, but I want to customize this because what I would really like is a grid that tells me where the exact center of my document is. So I can make a an object or a graphic like right in the center of my poster. So I'm going to go to Photoshop, Preferences, Guides, Grid, and Slices. And then I am going to make a grid line instead of 1 inch, I'm going to change this to percent, okay? And I'm going to make a grid line every 50%. And from here, you'll see now that I have a very, very handy grid that is showing me the exact center of my document, which is very, very useful. And because I don't like to clutter up my space with too many lines where I'll easily get confused, what I'm going to do is place a guide over the center point. So then I can Command apostrophe and make my guide go away. And now I have a really handy custom grid that I've made for myself that shows me the exact center of my document, as well as the margins around the edge of my document so that all of my important content is going to get placed inside there. Pretty handy, right? I think so. So now let's say we're going to lay out some imagery on our document. Let's say, I'm going to have a shape on here. We'll go to our custom shape library and find some sort of custom shape. Maybe I'll use that burst there. Or how about this butterfly? I'm going to use a butterfly. And now I'm going to go to my shape option, of course, so that I can draw a vector shape. And I'll hold down the shift button and I'm going to place that butterfly right in the center of my document. All right, so I can go right there. That's the exact center of my document. And I'll just make my butterfly just a little bit bigger. So Command T to increase the size of your document, and then hold down the shift button to maintain aspect ratio. And now when you're done resizing, hit enter or return. And now we can use this object that you've now placed on the document to help you create alignment, which is what we're going to talk about in a little bit. So let's say my next step after placing this image onto my document is to place text onto my document. Well, I don't want to just place my text randomly. I want my text to support my image, and I want everything to feel aligned. So I can bring out these guidelines. I can click on my ruler, click and drag. I can bring these guidelines to the edge of my butterfly wings. And that way, all of my text is going to go and fit nicely inside of those vertical lines, right? So my text will be aligned with the butterfly wings. And now I want to create a nice consistent margin between the butterfly and the text. So what I can do is bring down another line, top of my wings, at the bottom of my wings. And I'll create a 1/4 inch margin between my butterfly and my text. So I will drag this guideline down and I'll find a 1/4 inch, which is right there. Snapped back into place. Let's do it again. There we go. And And that was just ever so slightly. There we go. And so now when I'm placing my text on here, my text will get to fit like so, and everything will feel very aligned, right? And if I were to then at some point have more text, I wanted some more text on top, I can place another 1/4 inch margin. Right, and have more text like that. So everything will be nice and aligned. The margins will be nice and consistent. Right, and we can create a nice consistency in our design. We're going to get into the principles of design in just a little bit, but I just want to encourage you to pay very close attention when you are saving your main file in different formats. When you're working for a client, it's very common that your client is going to want a version of that project, made really large as a poster for print, right? So it's going to be 300 resolution. It's going to be very large. And then they're also going to want a smaller version of that project, maybe for a postcard. So it's going to be 300 resolution, but a little smaller. And then the client will also want something made for the web as well. So you're going to be taking that same PSD document and then outputting that design in different sizes and different formats. So it's very, very important that you don't accidentally shrink your main native file. And you may be wondering, well, why would I do that? Believe me, it can happen. So let's take a look at a pretend scenario where you are going to be taking this design and outputting it for the web and then also for print. So I'm going to save this first as my native file format. So I'm going to go File, Save As, and I'll save this to my desktop as Important Project, right? As a PSD document with all the layers, because I want to be able to come back to this later. And so the first thing that the client wants is a 72 resolution design that is meant for the website. So it needs to be shrunk down to 500 pixels on its shortest side. So what we're going to do is go to image size. And we're going to shrink down this resolution first to 72. And then we're going to change the width to 500. And then we're going to click OK, right? So we've now shrunk down our file, and this is going to be made for the web. And then I'm going to go to File, Export, Save for Web. And then I'm going to select the JPEG option, which is up here. And then I'm going to hit Save. And then I'll just save this to my desktop. And I'll call this for web. Now, let's say I am now, before I save the version that's meant for print, I have to leave my computer. I have to go do something. So I'm going to exit out of Photoshop. So I'll go File, right, Close All. And what is Photoshop going to ask me? Save or don't save? Well, if you hit Save, then you are permanently saving your PSD file, your native file, as a small 72 resolution project at 500 pixels, and you've lost now all of the resolution that you originally had. So what you want to do before you exit out of Photoshop and save and go on to do another project is Command Z, right? Option Command Z, and make sure image size, your image is back to the full resolution. If you accidentally save that PSD file as a small resolution, you can't just resave it as high resolution anymore, because that will take a small resolution project, stretch it to make it bigger, and it will end up getting blurry and pixelated. So it's very, very important that you pay very close attention to the resolution and size of your native file, and don't accidentally save it shrunken down. So as promised, I said I would show you how to save something for print. So the first thing we're going to do is go up to Image, Mode, and right now we're on RGB color, and I'm going to change it to CMYK color. It's going to ask if you want to flatten the image, and what you're going to do is click Don't Flatten. And then click OK. Next, we're going to save this as a PDF. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and we're going to select PDF. Now, it says down here, layers. Do you want to keep layers on, or do you want to uncheck layers? Now, you already have your Photoshop document, your PSD document that has all of your layers. So one, you don't need to save the layers on your PDF. And two, it's strongly, strongly encouraged that you do not save the separate layers on a PDF that's meant to go for print, because there can be problems with software at certain printing places, with sending a layered PDF over the internet. For whatever reason, sometimes those layers will not show up. So it's very important that you uncheck layers. And it's also important because it will make a smaller file size. The resolution will still be good, and the imagery itself will still be very high quality. But it's very important that the file size, in order to make it easy to send over email and all of that, be relatively low. And now I'm going to hit Save. Click OK. And now here's where you can adjust your settings, right? If you are making a high quality print, you'll make high quality print. If you are sending something to your instructor for a class and you're uploading it to the gradebook, I would encourage you to use smallest file size so that it uploads quickly and it will look fine in the gradebook. So we're going to select high quality print. And now here's the checkbox for preserve Photoshop editing capabilities. We want to uncheck that. Uncheck preserve Photoshop editing capabilities. Again, it will help you make a smaller file size. Save PDF. So now you have a PDF version of your project, as well as a JPEG and a PSD. So let's talk about contrast, one of the first principles of design. And I would say this is probably the principle of design that people most have trouble with. I would say contrast and alignment are the two principles that give people the most trouble. And usually contrast issues happen because people are focusing on the color and the images and not the value. So you can overcome a lot of contrast issues by first making your design in black and white, or at some point in the design process, viewing your design in black and white so that you can ensure that it's easy to still read. Now, if you look over here on the blue and red poor contrast, if you look at it, you can kind of feel like maybe your eyes are vibrating a little bit. That vibration happens when you're looking at two colors that are nearly identical in value. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about value? Value is the lightness or darkness of a certain hue, right? So if you were to view this blue and red text in black and white, that red would be nearly identical in terms of value to its background. And what you want to do is make sure that there is at least 50% difference in value between your foreground and background in order to maintain readability. So what does that mean? Well, let me throw a background on here. Actually, I'll do something because you know, sometimes students get really excited about all of the different tools and everything in Photoshop. So sometimes you'll see students getting out their gradient tool and then let's do a little something like this. There we go. This is something I've seen before. So a student will get really excited about the gradient background that they've made. And then they know that they have to have their text be a different color than their background. So they will, you know, choose blue or purple or something that's a different color than the background, but the value is the same. Okay, so watch what happens when I view something like this. If your eyes are not already vibrating, um, this is how you can tell if there's not enough value. So take a look. If I get my eyedropper tool out and I take a sample of that gray, right, we're kind of like right in the middle of the color picker. Then I'm gonna take a color of the sample of the background, and you can see here, you know, kind of slightly lower in the middle, and then kind of slightly higher in the middle. These two color swatches, the hue values, are nearly identical. You know, they're like just, you know, less than half an inch apart on the color picker. So that is how you know that you're going to get a design that is going to cause that vibration effect and make it really hard for someone to read. A better way to do it would be to, one, please don't make a gradient background. Gradient backgrounds almost never work. So instead, you know, you get out your paint bucket tool, and instead of choosing a background color that is in this middle range of your color picker, choose a background color that is either way down here or way up here. So then you can choose a text that is going to be on the opposite side of the color picker. So I'm going to choose a blue that's way up there. Oops, need to put this on a separate layer. There we go. And already looking so much better. And then I will, instead of using hue saturation, I will just fill this in with a little color overlay. So you can see I chose a color that was way up there. Now I'm going to choose a color that's way down here. And it doesn't matter what hue I choose. It's going to end up looking good. Right? And it's going to end up being high contrast enough. So now when I throw that hue saturation on, let's merge those layers together. I'll get my eyedropper tool out and I'll take a little eyedropper sample of the background. Check out where this background is on the color picker. And now I'll choose the color picker on the foreground. And we're way down here. And let's go back and forth. Way up there, way down there. So we're getting now more contrast. It's going to be much more readable. And it's going to be overall much more appealing, okay? So that's probably the main issue with student work that I see, and that's contrast. And sometimes students will try and fix their poor contrast by adding things like strokes and glows and drop shadows, and that just ends up making the design more cluttered rather than solving the problem. So make sure that you have good contrast to make your text readable. Now, contrast doesn't just have to do with value and color. Contrast also has to do with, the text being used. And text pairing and font pairing is an art. You're going to learn more about font pairing in your typography classes. But font pairing is about choosing fonts that feel like they go together, but also have that level of contrast, that level of difference that makes them look like harmonious. So contrast can create harmony. If you're interested in, learning more about font pairing and getting some inspiration about it, you can go to Pinterest and do a search for font pairing, and you'll see things like, big, thick, wide fonts tend to look good with tall, skinny, hand-drawn fonts. And, you'll see like italics tend to look good with, in conjunction with like slightly bolder serif fonts. And you'll start to see that contrast is what makes things look good together. I also think about contrast in size. If you have a document that has all of your text the same size, the viewer won't know how to skim through the document or the visual hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is the idea that certain text elements, headlines, subheadings might be more important, so they grab your attention first. And then if you want to stick around and look at the design longer, then you can read, the paragraphs that are in smaller text. So also think about contrast in your visual elements. So having one large picture and one small picture is going to be much more effective than having 2 or 3 pictures that are all exactly the same size, because the viewer won't know which picture is the most important to look at. So think about, as you're designing, what do you want people to look at first? Make that thing the highest contrast, the largest, and you can also use your rule of thirds, have it placed on, the rule of thirds grid, and, use converging lines or use other design elements to draw your attention to that thing. So one thing on your design needs to be the most important, needs to be the thing that grabs your attention, and then everything else is secondary to that. And contrast can help quite a bit with that. Repetition. So repetition has to do with a lot of things. You can repeat a color, and this helps to make your design more cohesive. Obviously, if you had a design where everything is a different color, so I'm going to go back to before I merged my layers together. Or how about this instead? I will just redraw them. Right, so let's say you have some text elements here, and then you have some text elements here, a few text elements here, and here, and maybe something here. And you don't use repetition, so let's say then that all of your text is going to be a different color. And not just a different color, but also different levels of saturation. So we'll have some text that's highly saturated and some text that is very desaturated. You are going to end up with a design that looks like it was just randomly thrown together. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason behind all the colors. A coherent, color scheme repeats the same colors. So, if you're starting out and you're not quite savvy with color schemes yet, and you're not quite sure how to go about making a design with a effective color scheme, you might want to start with a monochromatic color scheme, which means that you use just one color in your design, and then you use different shades and hues of that color, right? And just by making our design monochromatic, by repeating the same blue hue, but just using different levels of value. A design that looked like a mess before now is starting to look somewhat elegant, right? And now same with shape. If I were to, instead of having the same square shape, have, some oval shapes, and perhaps some star shapes. And those stars, I should make different types of stars. This design is starting to look a little bit problematic, and maybe I'll even have some rounded rectangles in there, right? There doesn't seem to be any consistency to the shapes. So using a same repetitive color over and over again, using the same where is my polygon? There we go. using the same font over and over again, using the same shapes, using the same colors, using a consistent spacing between your margins is going to help use repetition. See, the margin here between these two squares is very thick and the rest of the margins are rather consistent. So what we want to do is just make sure all of our margins end up being the same, right? And it ends up making it look much more consistent. So repetition. And we talk about, there's something called fontitis. Fontitis is when you have 3 or more fonts in a design. So you might have some scripty font, some thick font, some sans serif font, some serif font. And by having so many different fonts in a design, it lacks consistency and it ends up looking cluttered and random. So using, the same 1 or 2 fonts throughout your whole design is going to help things look much stronger. Now, alignment, that's the whole thing that we've been talking about today. So without alignment, things will look very random. In fact, just take a look at the Helvetica example here. Notice that the large H in Helvetica creates a nice strong line. And that H there is lining up with this little h and this little n and this little h. And there's a space, and then it continues to line up with this text. If that text were over here a little bit more, and this text were over here a little bit more, and it weren't lined up like that, it would look random and it wouldn't look good. Same for, the L lining up with the I creates a nice alignment. And the E lining up with the A there also helps to create a nice alignment. So alignment is something that, is going to make this design in particular look much stronger. If I, had this guy over here and this guy over here a little bit more and this here, and I had my margins all different. I put like maybe this over here, and then I had this here at the edge there. See how it looks random? It doesn't look neat. It doesn't look well designed. So using your alignment is going to help make your design look much, much more consistent and professional. Proximity. By grouping things together, it makes things feel like they belong together. It also makes things feel more orderly. If you take a look at the equally spaced circles over on the left hand side, it looks like a pattern. There doesn't seem to be, there's order to it in that they're all equally spaced. But by putting these circles into columns and by grouping them together, there seems to be an order now. There seems to be like, this group of things belong together, these group of things belong together, and these group of things belong together. So when you're putting like a headline on an article, you want to keep that headline close to the article itself. You want to have all the imagery and all of the content for the article grouped together. And then for a separate article, you want to have the imagery and content, grouped together for that. If you have a caption on a picture, you want that caption to be right next to the picture. You want to group similar shaped things together. So you want to kind of create order by grouping things together using proximity. So a good strategy for success with laying out your design is using guides and grids. So thinking about the margins on the edge of your document. Think about making either a 1/4 inch margin or a 1/2 inch margin so that your important imagery and text isn't too close to the edge. Using grids to make the margins between text and images consistent. So, if there's an image, then there's a group of text, and there's a couple other images. All of the spaces between those images and that text are going to be exactly the same. Use symmetrical or asymmetrical balance. What does that mean? Let's talk about symmetrical and asymmetrical balance for a moment. Okay, so let's talk about the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is an idea in design that you're going to learn more about, where you imagine that your canvas, if you are viewing a document, actually, let me make an entirely new document. If you're viewing your canvas, or if you're viewing through your viewfinder of a camera, or if you are drawing on a sheet of paper, you imagine that canvas divided up into 3 equal vertical sections and 3 equal horizontal sections. And if you're using asymmetrical balance, you can place your most important visual element, your focal point, on one of those intersecting points between your horizontal and your vertical lines. So let's say I'm going to make that's my focal point. I'd place it on one of those intersecting points, and then I'd make everything else in my document support the idea that that is the focal point. So if I have other visual elements, I would make them lower contrast. And so let's say I'm going to use a little polygon tool. How about that? Right? So I can have all of my other visual elements supporting that in some way. Right? Have another starburst behind it. This time I'll have it be slightly lower contrast. So as you can see, the focal point is all geared towards that intersecting point. And if I wanted to make this a symmetrical design, I would make the focal point right in the center. And then I would make everything support the idea that that focal point is in the center. I would also make sure each side of my document is perfectly equal in terms of visual weight. So if I were to draw a straight vertical line down the center of my document, the left side of my document would be perfectly equal in terms of visual weight to the right side of my document. And you can use any of these intersecting points to create the focal point in asymmetrical balance. So I could put the focal point down here. I could put the focal point over here. I could put the focal point over here, right? And you're totally allowed to, if you want to have the focal point slightly over here, slightly over here, it doesn't have to be smack dab in the middle of the intersecting points. These are just guides. Another handy guide, if you are ever shooting video or if you're ever shooting portraits for people, instead of putting someone's head directly in the center of your viewfinder, if you're shooting with a camera, in fact, I'm just going to flip my canvas around. There we go. So imagine this is now more closely resembling a viewfinder on a camera. So imagine you are looking through your camera's viewfinder. Come on, guideline, you can do it. Imagine that viewfinder is divided up into 3 equal sections. And this sun now is going to be my person's face. So that's a little person's face now. So if you're photographing him, don't put his head directly in the center of your document. One, it's going to, in your viewfinder rather, one, it's going to make a very boring, not very appealing photograph or video if you're doing like an interview. Also, you're going to end up with a lot of space above that person's head. So a technique that professional photographers use and professional videographers is to place the eyes on the top third of the document. And you can use these imaginary intersecting points for an approximate place that you will place the person's head, right? So obviously you don't want to put the person's head way over here because there's too much empty space on the side of the document. But if you put someone's head here and you have a nice background, that's going to be a nice appealing asymmetrical composition. So putting a subject's eyes on the top third is a great way to go. Now keep in mind, when I'm talking about the rule of thirds, I'm not saying draw this rule of thirds grid over every single document that you make or every single work of art that you make. I'm saying imagine that grid on your document. Imagine approximately where those guidelines are going to be, and then think about where your focal point in your design is going to be, and place that focal point along one of those rule of thirds. Or if you are making something that is going to be symmetrical, place that in the center and make sure both sides of your document are going to be perfectly symmetrical. So rule of thirds, you're going to be learning more about that in other classes, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's certainly something that you can think about and keep in mind for your project this week. Next, visual hierarchy. Visual hierarchy allows you to scan a design and grab the information that you need from it without having to read every single word in that document. Now, imagine if you're opening up a novel, all of the text in that novel is going to be exactly the same size, right? And the only way to get the information that you need from it is to read from the top left to the right and then down. But with graphic design, It's about guiding your eye through a design and giving you the important information that you need, even if you aren't able to stay there and read every single piece of text on your on the poster or on whatever it is that you're looking at. So, let's say you're making an advertisement and you have some words that you want to use in the advertisement. So one word that you have is sale. Another word that you might have in the advertisement is something like 50% off. Maybe another word that you'll have in the advertisement is October 31st, 2000 whatever, 19, and a website URL, www.bigsale.com. Okay, so you have to decide what you want people to see first. What is going to be the focal point? Do you want the focal point to be the date? In that case, you might put the date in white inside that circle, right? And it might be October. You're going to want to make it huge, right? Because that's going to be the focal point. You can even tilt it a little bit. Now, if I were to have everything in this design at exactly that same size, it would be overwhelming, right? If I had sale at that size, if I had 50% off at that size, and I had bigsale.com at that size, it would be all too much to look at. So I want to make sale there, but I don't want it to compete with the date, right? So I might make it slightly large, but I don't want it to compete with the focal point. So I might make it lower resolution, or not lower resolution, lower opacity, right? And then do I want 50% off? I want to use alignment. Right, to make the S and the 5 line up nicely and the E to line up with the off, the F and off. And then big sale will be the last important thing. So I might lower the opacity on that again, right? So we have nice alignment there. And I also get to kind of play around with, where am I going to place this? Do I place this down here in the corner? I could. And then do I then make all of this bigger? So all of these choices are going to impact the visual hierarchy, right? So I can make all of this bigger. So the first thing that you're looking at here is the date, whether that's the most effective for an advertisement. That isn't that leaves itself to be decided, but the date is the highest point of contrast here. And then the other information is lower contrast. And we could easily flip these two, right? So I could decide then, you know what? I don't want the date to be the focal point. I'll put it over here, and this time I'll change my text color. And then I'm going to make the sail that's going to be the focal point. So that means I need to make all of this much higher contrast. So using a little bit of white, right? Nice and high contrast. And then that means the date is going to be much smaller and lower contrast. So that is visual hierarchy, playing with what is the focal point. So guides and grids help us to lay out our design, and make consistent alignment and make consistent margins. They also help us use asymmetrical and symmetrical balance. We can use the rule of thirds when incorporating, our grid, but we need to pay attention to visual hierarchy, the idea of what it is that viewers are looking at first and what they're looking at second and what reads third, etc. So some good reminders when it comes to making your designs. Keep it simple. Choose ideally one or two fonts for your design. Choose a simple color scheme. If colors aren't yet something that you are an expert on, don't worry if you're not an expert on colors. But if colors are something that you're not yet an expert on, then use a monochromatic color scheme. Look at your design in several different colors with different fonts. So, view what your design might look like if you use a serif font or a sans serif font. And consider outputting all of your variations onto a contact sheet, which is what I'm going to show you how to do next. Okay, let's now go through the process of making a poster. And then we're going to experiment with looking at that poster in different fonts with different color schemes, slight variations, and then we'll output those different variations using a contact sheet so we can look at them all side by side and see which one is going to be the most effective for a project. So I'm going to go into Photoshop and we're going to make a poster for print. So that means the sizes I'm going to use are a nice large size in inches, about 11 by 17, a nice high resolution, and then the color mode will be CMYK. Now, I want to do the same thing that I showed you earlier, where I find the exact center of the document. So I'm going to hit Command apostrophe to bring up the guides that I already made, and then click on the rulers. And by the way, if your rulers are not showing up, you can hit Command or Control R to make your rulers come up. And now I can bring out these guides, which will be very useful. And then I can Command apostrophe to make my grid go away. Now I'll start with, just like I did before, a shape in the center, but this time I'm going to incorporate some photo elements. So I will find some photos and then I'll clip them to the shape in order to make some sort of interesting design. And we'll start with something kind of, a kind of a generic design, and we'll see what happens. How about this cloud? Okay, and I'm going to composite then some photo elements into the cloud. Now, if I draw a white cloud on a white background, you won't see anything. So what I'm going to do is change my fill. It doesn't matter what color I choose for my fill. Change my fill, hold down the shift button, click and drag on my trackpad at a diagonal angle. And then I need to place that cloud right in the center of my document. So I'll hit V. V is the move tool. And then I'd like to see the bounding box so I can see the exact center of my cloud. So I will hit Command T, and see, it's handy because it gives you the exact center there. I'll just ever so slightly make my cloud a little bit bigger. There we go. And now I want to incorporate some photo elements. So I'm going to make a new layer. And I'll bring in some photos by going to File, Place Embedded. And what I'm going to do is use that cloud shape to create a clipping mask. And I'm going to clip these different photo elements inside the cloud, right? To make like a little collage. So I brought her in. Remember, Command T to transform, and Shift to shrink, Shift, click and drag to shrink, and then hover over the corners to rotate. I did that a little fast, so I just want to make sure I give you guys a chance to see how I did all that. And then Enter or Return to place the picture into my document. Now I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key on my keyboard, bring my cursor to the line between the picture and the shape, and then I will click, right? And so then we have clipped that photo into the shape. And now I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, bring in another picture. Again, same thing. I'm going to hold down the Shift button, click and drag, click near the corner to rotate, right, and rotate it into place. And then Enter or Return. Now, when I clip this picture in, it's going to be overlapping the other picture, so I will want to mask it to blend the two pictures together. So I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option button, and I'm going to click on the line between the two pictures to clip it into place. Now I'm going to get my layer mask icon out, the square with the circle inside of it. I'm going to get my brush tool out, and then with a soft edge brush, notice the brush setting is set to 0% hardness. I can paint and see how now I can blend these two pictures together. And now let's add some more photos. See, so we're making like a photo collage. So I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, hold down the Shift button, click and drag, rotate, Enter or Return, Alt or Option, and click on the line. And then I'm going to get my square with a circle inside of it, click on it, and get my brush tool out, make sure that my layer mask is selected, and paint. So see, we've now made a nice photo collage. And remember, you can, if you accidentally erase too much, like that, you can hit X on your keyboard and paint back in what you may have erased. X to toggle your foreground and background colors. Now, we're going to lay out some text on here as well. So I'm going to make a new layer, and I want to use the edge of my shape to create alignment. So I'm going to click on my rulers, click and drag to drag out some nice guidelines. Got a little bit, moved it a little bit, so I'm going to get my move tool out and move it back into place. And I'm going to add another there. There. And then I want to make it just a little 1/4 inch margin. And now we're ready for some text. So I'm going to get my text tool out. And I don't know what the text is going to be. So we'll have it say slogan, slogan, slogan. And then I'm going to get my move tool out, Command T to transform. We'll make some more text. I just want to shrink that in just a little bit because the S is going ever so slightly outside my guideline that I created. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll have a slightly larger slogan on top. Getting some, visual hierarchy. And then I'm going to have additional text underneath. Now I want the text that's underneath to not compete with the text that's on top. So I'll probably use a different font or a grayish color so that it doesn't have as much contrast as the text on top. And then this will be like additional information, additional information, text. And if I was smart, I would use some lorem ipsum, but this is fine too. Goes here. Okay, so I want a text that contrasts a little bit with the bold impact, but doesn't compete with it. So I am going to use something like, I think, Helvetica, something narrow, thin, right? And I just want to shrink it down a little bit so that it fits inside my guidelines like so. And then I want to have a website URL at the bottom. And the website URL is going to be very, very small. So I'm going to use center align and place it right here. And I'm going to make this, I don't want this website URL to compete with this text here. I want it to be less visually important. So I'm going to shrink the font size down like so, nice and small. And then for both of these, I think the black is still drawing too much attention to itself. So I'm going to change my font to a gray color. So I'm going to highlight that text, go up to the black that's at the top of the screen, choose a gray color, and then for the website URL, I'll lower my opacity a whole lot. So it's just kind of there at the bottom. Good. And then if we want to see what this poster looks like without all of the text on it, or no, not without the text on it, without the grids on it, we're going to hit command semicolon and command apostrophe to make those guides and grids go away, right? So now we have a good idea of what our poster looks like without those guides and grids. And we can, add a little bit of an extra touch, a slight drop shadow, I think, behind the cloud might be a good way to go. So I'm going to double click on the cloud and I'm going to go to drop shadow. And we want the drop shadow to be not quite so extreme. Oops. Notice I lowered the opacity. I accidentally lowered the opacity on the overall layer on the blending options. You want to double click on your drop shadow here and lower the opacity. And lower the distance, and lower the spread, and lower the size. So we just have a slight drop shadow. Alrighty, there we go. So this will be version 1 of our poster. And then we'll do some additional adjustments and we'll do a few different versions. And then we'll look at all of those different versions side by side on a contact sheet so we can choose which one looks the best. So I'm going to save this one. So I'm going to go File, Save As. I'll save this to my desktop under a folder called Project Variations. Oh, I didn't name it. Let's do that. File, Save As. Project version 1. Now I'm going to start making changes to this, so I want to make sure that the changes I make don't get applied to that project version 1 that I just made. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as project version 2. Now let's make some changes. So first, I think I want to put like a little vignette around it. So I'm going to make a new layer. And I'm going to get my brush tool out. And with a low opacity, I'm just lowering my opacity to about 70. Just going to ever so slightly darken the corners. Now I'm going to get out my eraser, and I want my eraser to be nice and soft as well. I'm just noticing that, I may have darkened a little bit too much by the website URL down there. So I'm just going to lighten up that little part there. And then I'll throw a color adjustment over the whole thing. So I'm going to go to my circle that's light on one side, dark on the other. And I'm going to go to hue saturation. Do a little colorize. Move my hue slider around. Let's see. Get a color that's kind of interesting. There we go. And then I want to bring back the color that was in the photos. So I'm going to get my brush tool out. I'm going to paint on the layer mask that's right next to the hue saturation adjustment layer. And I want to make sure that I see those little brackets around that hue saturation layer mask so that I'm not accidentally painting somewhere where I shouldn't be. Okay, so now I'm just going to ever so slightly add some color back to this. So it's still a little bit, everything's a little bit warm, but it now has color in the cloud. So now let's save that. So go File, Save. And then I want to make a third project. So I'm going to go File, Save As. Change this as Project Variation 3. And with this one, I'm going to choose a different font. So I'm going to get my text out. Instead of Impact, I want something, we'll try Helvetica New Condensed Black. Something sans serif and bold. And we still want everything to line up with our guidelines. So I'm going to get my Command T out, hold down the Shift button, click on the corners. Get my text tool out. Command T. I'm just hitting V for my move tool and my down arrow to move it down slightly. Next, I'll change the font down here. Now, how might it look if we used a slight serif font? Ooh, that's kind of nice. I was looking for a serif, but I think that kind of looks nice. Command T. Hold down the Shift button, click and drag. There we go. And then the website URL down here, I'll get my text tool out. And actually, did I choose for that font? Cool. It's a little disappointing when you just try and select the text and it keeps on making new text layers. Okay. Okay, and then just for variation, let's see what happens if we just change our hue saturation to something slightly different. Now I'm going to, and we'll just lower the opacity of it a little bit. Okay, good. Now I'm going to go to File, Save, and now we're going to do a fourth version. File, Save As, and we'll select 4. There we go. And on this version, I'll throw a texture over everything. So I'm going to make a new layer, Shift Command N. Now I'll go to File, Place Embedded. I'll look for a paper texture, and we'll throw a texture over everything. Now it came in at 33%, so I can hold down the Shift button, click and drag to increase the size of my texture. And now I can hit Enter or Return to place it. Now I can experiment with some different blending modes. So Overlay is going to make that texture show up just in the shadow areas, which is kind of nice. Not thrilled with how it's kind of going over the skin there. So we can get a layer mask out, we can get our brush tool out, and we can ever so slightly, remove the texture from certain areas. And now we'll just see what it looks like as far as changing the color a bit. And we'll go to File, Save, and now we'll do another version where we change the blending modes a little bit. So I'll go File, Save As, and we'll call this 5. Click on that texture, and I'm going to change it to Hard Light. And see, with Hard Light, the texture shows up in the highlights as well as the shadows. So I'm going to lower my opacity. And let's change the color a little bit. Now we'll save that file, save. Another thing we can opt to do is change the hue of the cloud itself and have that be a separate color from the background. In order to make it not affected by the hue saturation at all, I'll hold down the Shift button and I'll select all 4 of these layers and then click and drag them up to the top of my document so that it's not affected by the texture or the hue saturation layer. Next, I'm going to double click on the shape layer and I'll throw a color overlay over it. Now you want to make sure that you double click on these layer styles as you apply them so that when you adjust the settings, you're adjusting the settings on the layer style that you want. Okay, I'm going to choose just for something different, some purple. And you may be wondering, well, what's the point? Because you've now covered up your photos. Well, what I'm going to be doing is putting this color on a blending mode. So see here we have our blending modes. I'll put this on the color blending mode, and that allows us to see the color, the picture, and the color is applied to the picture. Now we can use adjustment layers and clip the adjustment layer directly to that cloud picture. And that way we can quickly scroll through and see how this might look in different colors. So I'm going to go to my adjustment layer. I'll click on hue saturation. And I'm going to clip hue saturation to this group of layers by holding down the Alt or Option button and clicking on the line between hue saturation and the pictures. Next, I'm going to scroll through and see what this might look like. Oh, you know what? Instead of changing the overall color, do a little saturation. There we go. Now, what we can also do is apply the overall color to the overall hue saturation color adjustment to the whole poster. And we can see what that looks like as well. All right, so you can kind of see, oh, okay, that looks interesting, that looks interesting. And then that blue is really, really nice. What might look good is using that blue color for the slogan. So I am going to go to our slogan layer. And I'm going to hold down the Shift button, select both of those slogan layers, and then I'm going to hit Command J. Then I'll hit Command E to merge them together, and I'll drag them up this way. Notice I didn't delete my original layers. I duplicated them before I merged them. Now with this, I can go to my layer style by double clicking on the blank blue area next to that layer. And I can go to color overlay. Then I can click on my color picker and click a nice blue color. And I'll change my blending mode to normal. I just want to go slightly darker. And then same for the subtext down here. Hold down the Shift button, click on both layers. I will hit Command J to duplicate those layers, and then Command E to merge them together. I'll drag them up here. And then I will double click on the blank blue area next to this layer. That brings up the layer styles. Then I'll click on color overlay. It already selected the color I want. So now I can hit OK. So this will be another version. So I'll go File, Save. Now let's see a few different color variations. I'll throw another hue saturation adjustment layer on this. Move my hue saturation slider around. And see how this might look. File, Save As, and I'll call this Project Variation 6. Another adjustment layer that's really, really handy to use is gradient map. And what gradient map does is it recolors a picture using the values in that picture. So it will apply a certain color to certain values, another color to another values, and it will create this kind of gradual, almost duotone effect. So I'm going to go to the circle that's light on one side, dark on the other, and I'll click on gradient map. And here I will double click on our gradient. And you can select different gradients and see how they work. Obviously, some look pretty cool, some not so much. What you can do is add a little lightness in there. Move our stops around. Choose a slightly kind of interesting, right? But if that's a little bit too much for you, you can always experiment with what this looks like on a blending mode, such as color. And you can also experiment with what this looks like on overlay, soft light, etc. Hard light, lower the opacity a bit. And then we'll go File, Save As. Project Variation 7. Now let's do one more overall hue saturation adjustment. So I'll go to my circle that's light on one side, dark on the other. And I'll click on hue saturation. And we'll just drag the slider around, see what this could possibly look like in a different sort of color scheme. I think I like that. We can even see what this looks like in a different blending mode, such as overlay. And we can go File, Save As. Now we have 8 different versions of this. And feel free, when you're making a project, make 10 different versions, make 20 different versions, and then look at them all side by side and see which one pops out the most and which one seems the most effective. You can also show your friends and say, hey, tell me which one you like the best. Now I'm going to go to File, Automate, and we're going to make our contact sheet, which will allow us to see all of these different versions side by side. We're going to use Files. I'm going to browse to these files and click Open. And we're going to make a document that's 8 by 10, 300 resolution. We have 8 projects. So if we were to have 2 columns and 3 rows in a column, that would allow, or actually 4 rows in a column because we have 8. That would allow, I think, a good ability to see all of them. And And then we'll click OK. And what's really fun about contact sheets is that it does all the work for you. So you get to sit back and relax and watch while Photoshop does all the magic and you don't have to do anything. And in just a moment, we'll have our contact sheet. Just let Photoshop do its thing. There we go. There are all of our different project versions. And so you get to look at these and think, okay, which one do I like the best? And you could even send this to your client if you're doing something for a client and ask them, hey, which one do you like the best? Right? It's a really, really handy tool. And all you have to do, this is an entirely new project now. So all you have to do is save it as a JPEG and then you can email it. So of these, I kind of like project variation 4. And I kind of like the last one a lot. So then what you can do is do a bunch of different variations of this poster and play around with different colors, not just different colors, but play around with different text, play around with different ways that you could place the images on this. So for instance, I could move my cloud up, get rid of this. I'm hitting V for my move tool. I can move this cloud up a little bit. And then I can move my slogan down, right? And this could be another variation. And we'll call this file, save as 8A. We'll do a different hue here. Maybe we'll do a little colorize. And I'll call this 8B. We'll try something even different. We'll call this 8C. And then we also liked the project 4, so we can do a few variations of project version 4 as well. I can throw a little hue saturation on top of this. And not liking so much how it's affecting the color of the faces, so we can mask out that. So we can go to File, Save As, and call this 4A. can change the color. And do File, Save As, 4B. And then we can look at all of these on a contact sheet. So I can go to File, Automate, Contact Sheet. We'll browse to our files, and we're going to use all the different 4 variations and open that. And then we're going to use all the different 8 variations and open that. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Excellent. And let's look at them all side by side. And almost done. Fantastic. And then from here, go ahead and, show this to your client or look at which one you like the best, and you can continue to do more variations. Now, since we're talking about print production this week and making things for print, this is a good time to talk about duotones, tritones, and quadtones, which is a way that you can set up your project so that it will work for very specific inks that you might choose when printing. So let's say you're making a design and you want it to be printed with a certain Pantone ink for branding. And Pantone is a company, it's a color standards company, and you go to Pantone.com, or you might see these Pantone color swatches. You'll learn more about Pantone in your color theory classes, but choosing a Pantone color allows you to make absolutely certain, regardless of where your document is printed, the colors are going to look exactly the same. So if you think about like Pepto-Bismol pink, and you want to make absolutely certain that that Pepto-Bismol packaging is printed the exact same color pink, whether it's in Shanghai or Los Angeles or New York, you would choose a certain Pantone color to do that. So Photoshop allows you to select those colors for printing. The first thing that you have to do, though, is convert your document to black and white. So I will hit Shift Command Option E to merge my layers together. And then I will go to Image, Mode, and then select Grayscale. And then we'll just flatten it for now. And then I will go to Image, Mode, and Duotone. And this duotone thing is going to let us choose specific colors for our project. So if we choose a monotone, that means the only ink or the only color that's going to be printed is black. So, and it's kind of going to be a gradient where, the dark areas are going to be black, and then the lighter areas are going to have no black. So I can choose a specific Pantone color to do this by clicking on this color swatch and then going to color libraries. And then we have different books that we can choose from here in our color libraries. So I can choose any of these Pantone books and then choose a specific Pantone color. And now my document is going to only be printed in that Pantone 282C color, okay? Now, if I want to, and hey, let's save this version as one version to look at. So I'll go OK, and I'll go to File, Save As, and I'll call this Pantone 282. Now, another thing you can do is make a duotone, which means it's going to be printed using two inks. So if I go to Image Mode, Duotone again, instead of monotone, I'll select duotone. And for the second color, I'll go to my color libraries and I'll choose something light. Some sort of light pink color, perhaps. And you'll notice that right now it's blending the two colors together perfectly equally. But you can adjust the curves in these little ink squares here so that the ink will only be applied to the light areas or to the dark areas. So I'm going to save this for now, just so we can have this variation. So the file save as. And then I will make adjustments. So go to Image Mode, Duotone, and this time I'm going to adjust the curve. Watch what happens. I'm starting to see more of those pinks. And now we're starting to see more of the pinks in the highlights. And what we can do is we can make pinks show up in the highlights and not show up in the shadows. And then I can go to this ink and I can make a lot of dark show up in the shadows and then not so much in the highlights. And so this kind of looks a little bit like the gradient map, doesn't it? But this is very specific because it's telling it, where you're going to put those inks. I'm going to cancel. I'm going to try it one more time. There you go. I think that looks much nicer. And now I'll click OK and I'll save this. Okay, now let's choose completely different colors. We can use one of these customs, which is very nice. Save that. And this whole process is very useful if you are asked by your client to only use two colors, maybe to save money, maybe because this is going to be like a newspaper advertisement and only two colors are allowed. There's a lot of different reasons why you might do this. Now let's look at these all side by side. Actually, let's do one more. Let's do a quad tone mode. So quad tone is when you have four colors, obviously. a tritone. That looks kind of nice. And we'll make it a quad tone with one more color. So I'll save this as quad tone. And now we'll look at them all side by side. So we'll go to Automate, Contact Sheet. There are our different versions there. And we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here now is our contact sheet of different duotones. Interesting. And I kind of like that brown one a lot. What do you think? So as we wrap up the class, let's just take a moment to cover some reminders on our poster project. So we're going to keep it simple, right? And keeping it simple means that we stick to 1 or 2 fonts. We don't go overboard with fontitis. We have a very clear focal point. So we have, one thing that's going to grab our eye first in the case of the project that I just demonstrated. It's the photo collage in the center. Consider limiting your colors. Use contrast to make that focal point stand out. We just did a number of variations where we experimented with different colors, with different textures, so you can then look at them all side by side. So let's review these principles of design that we've talked about. Good contrast means being able to see your text or your imagery from far away. So we talk about contrast and value, and we're talking about readability. So make sure that your background colors are nice and dark or very, very light, so that your text can be the opposite of that. If you have dark, dark values for your background, light, light text. If you have light, light values for your background, then you're going to have dark, dark text. And pay attention to value rather than color. If you're thinking that you're making contrasting colors and it's going to be readable, you will run into a problem, because you'll get this problem here where you have poor contrast, because though the colors may be different, the values are the same, resulting in that vibration effect that happens in your eye. Now, contrast doesn't just have to do with color or value. It also has to do with text. So, using a thick text next to a thin, tall, skinny text makes for good font pairing. And then also include contrast in terms of size, so something large next to something small, or contrast in shape, so something that's square next to something that is circular. But repetition helps too. So repeating the same color scheme throughout the document helps to make it all feel cohesive. Repeating the same shape pattern, again, makes it all feel cohesive. Repeating the same fonts over and over again also helps to avoid fontitis and make things look cohesive. And then alignment. So using those guides and grids in your Photoshop document will help to ensure that your piece feels aligned and it doesn't feel like text and image elements have just been randomly placed all over the document. Using alignment is going to help make your piece feel like there is order to it and there is structure to it. And then proximity. placing important elements close together. So in the case of the poster I just demonstrated, I had the photo collage, right? And the photo collage helped to use proximity because it helped to bring all those photos together. Instead of the photos just being randomly placed around the document, one up in the top corner, one at the bottom corner. They're all in the center inside that cohesive shape. Then also the slogans and the text were placed close to the photo collage. So it helps it all feel like it belongs together. And then the website URL was apart from that because that's the thing that you're going to look at last. So when you're working on your project, use guides and grids, use symmetrical or asymmetrical balance, use your rule of thirds, and use visual hierarchy. And you can use these principles of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity to create nice visual hierarchy. So thank you guys so much for joining me today in our DES104 class. We have covered a lot of new tools in Photoshop, and I think you guys have probably created some really awesome projects in this last 4 weeks. But keep in mind, Photoshop is a very complex program with a lot of different tools. And it's under you're not going to learn all of the tools available in Photoshop in 4 weeks. Just like you're not going to be able to play any sort of piano music after just 4 weeks of piano classes. You're not going to know every single tool in Photoshop after only 4 weeks. But you have the basics, and most importantly, you know what you need to do. You know an effective project has lots of layers so that you can work non-destructively and easily make changes. You know now that the basic principles of design and how you can use those principles of design in a Photoshop project. You know your brush tools and your retouching tools and your shape tools and the difference between vector and raster and all of that. So now it's about seeing how you can continue to develop your skill and your craft as a graphic designer. So the best way to do it is just not to just rely on your Photoshop classes, but to be a self-motivated learner. That means if you're out in the world and you see a design that's really interesting to you, think about how that design was made. And if you're looking at something and you just have no idea how it was possibly made, you can go on YouTube and usually you can find a tutorial video that shows you how to create a look that maybe you've seen out in the world. For instance, if you look at Jill Greenberg photos and you might love that Jill Greenberg style, you can go on YouTube and you can find video tutorials that will show you how to match the Jill Greenberg style in Photoshop. And maybe you might want to, once a week, go on YouTube and find an interesting Photoshop tutorial and then see if you can copy it and practice that technique. Or make a point to learn one new Photoshop tool or technique every week. Or just make your own Photoshop project outside of school once a week just to build your portfolio. Think about it. If you make one Photoshop project per week, it doesn't have to be something you spend a long time on. It can just be something that you spend 30 minutes on. You'll have 52 new Photoshop projects at the end of a year. That's 52 projects you can then add to your portfolio. Or better yet, find 20 of the best projects and just include those in your portfolio instead of all 52. But the more you practice with Photoshop, the more you'll realize it's actually not a scary program at all. It's actually a lot of fun, and it's not like a program that you have to do things exactly a certain way in order for it to be right. You can accomplish the same task using 4 or 5 different methods. And you can come up with your own workflow and your own way of working as well. So thank you guys so much for being fantastic students. And if you have any questions about Photoshop, about your assignments this week, definitely don't hesitate to email your teacher. Your teacher is here for you.